Chatting this morning, Blake Vartanian, Realty Pro 100, is with us. And, we never know what we're going to talk about, Blake.
No.
We just kind of wing it. But, you're a little more organized than I am. So I saw this morning a message that you sent out talking about inventory in the market. So I just brought it up on my screen. Active inventory, not a lot out there.
No, there's not. Based on historical numbers, I mean, it is modestly increasing, but it's certainly not anything, dramatic. It's 1% change, maybe 1 percentage point, a half percentage point in inventory. And we literally could have 3 times the amount of inventory we currently have in active sales, in active listings, and still not have enough homes to meet the balance, what would be considered a balanced market.
Yeah, I'm looking at one of the numbers, and the numbers that you shared earlier today, they're not going to match what I'm going to share right now. Mm-hmm. And I know why they're not going to match, because I'm looking at a single zip code. You're looking at multiples, and yours is active listings. I'm just looking at single family. But I'm looking at Anaheim 92807. Total properties on the market, 28 this week. Last week, 27.
Yeah, so there you go.
Right, that's single family. There's nothing to buy.
No, in relative terms, compare that to, let's say, the 2008 cycle, you would have seen probably 40 to 45 in minimum in each of those zip codes, maybe as high as 60 in Anaheim Hills, each of the zip codes.
60,
maybe.
Really?
Yeah, at different times, depending on the cycle. Because this is the way I measure the health of a market. If you go down a street and there's no real estate signs for sale, it's a seller's market.
Okay.
All right. If there's one sign, it's a seller's market.
Let's go back to that a minute, Blake, because when you say it's a seller's market, there's no signs on the street, and I want to buy.
Yes.
I could probably convince somebody on that street to buy if I pay them enough.
That's exactly the point.
So the seller's got all the cards in their hand.
They got all the cards. You're going to have to do something to move them out of their house, which is typically overpay them, incentivize them to get their attention.
I'm looking at, I just pulled up while we're talking, 92808. 8 single family residences. Yeah, last week there was 7, so somebody changed their mind and decided to sell. Maybe there's that one person that you just found on the street, right?
Could be. Could be.
So it's easy to say we're still in a seller's market.
We are definitely in a seller's market, and even with the the higher interest rates, based on historical terms, interest rates aren't high. They're high based on the last 10 years or 11 or 12 years.
Sure.
But if you go back, to some of us have multiple decades in our experiences.
I'm not that old,
right? And we saw double-digit interest rates. And there were still 8,000 sales a month in Orange County. If you go back and look at DataQuick in 1987, 88, at the beginning of the DataQuick measurement, it wasn't uncommon to see 6,500 or 7,000 property sales in a single month in Orange County, with a population that's probably 1 million plus smaller than it is today.
Wow. Okay, so that's a big difference. So you said 6,500.
Yeah.
And I think that the chart that you shared earlier today shows 2,400.
Yes.
So it's about, rough math, don't hold me to it. It's about 25%.
Yeah, we're not exact.
Right, about 25%. So there's a 75% shortfall of properties available.
And there are multiple articles that you can type in Google. What is the national demand for housing versus the supply? And there's about an estimated 4 million households that are behind in the demand curve, that are trying to find a place to go. So they're looking for housing, but there isn't enough inventory. So when you're saying the new inventory coming on isn't matching the new inventory demand,
household formations,
then you have the household formations that are already existing that are looking for a new place to go, and that's not a short-term problem. And for some areas it is, because real estate is local.
Sure.
So you can go one block in the suburbs of, let's say, Portland. I hear is on fire around Portland, but in Portland it's actually on fire.
I was gonna say, Portland is really literally burning.
So I don't wish that on anyone who's made an investment or wants to call a place their home. because one of the beauties of home is quiet.
I'm going to throw it in there, Blake. I don't feel sorry for any of them.
Well,
because they voted for who they've got.
Well, that's true. We all
right. I mean,
we all get stuck with the leadership.
If you're not excited about Los Angeles and what's going on in Los Angeles, vote for somebody different.
Right, with a different
right. That's plan. You've got that opportunity, but that's a whole different story. We don't want to get into that one, right? So, but the bottom line is and I like what you're saying, Blake, about the idea of the interest rates, because the interest rates are there. Maybe this is the new normal in interest rates.
I think when you look at how much the Fed is borrowing, I mean, they just gave themselves a $4 trillion credit line extension.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. That's what they did. So, I mean, could you imagine if you and I could just look at our bank account and go, I want another $100,000 to just miraculously be there for my spending needs?
My wife could handle that. She'd have no problem with it at all.
For some people, it might be a weekend, but
right.
for others, that would be a lifetime's worth of savings.
Yeah, and I've got a chart here. I'm going to try and get it over to Josh real quick and see if we can send this so we can share this. But if you look at the last 5 decades of mortgage rates, just amazing what they look like as far as going back to the 70s. 70s averaged 8.86.
Yeah.
The 80s averaged 12.7. The 90s averaged 8.12. And obviously, as I keep talking, I'm not getting it to Josh, so makes it a little more difficult for him to share it with you. But I'm gonna try and get it off there and see if I can. Josh, I'm gonna send this chart to you. Just I don't know when you'll be able to get it up, but the concept here is that interest rates are low by historic standards.
Well, and so there's different ways to address that. Let's say, there are housing stock out there that actually has separate units. They're not considered duplexes. I just saw a new construction a few months ago out in Palmdale, as an example. Beautiful homes, 5,000 square feet, with a built-in apartment. So
built-in apartment.
So 1 bedroom, 1 bath apartment. That's part of the builder's construction foresight. They were planning that these people, maybe they had a maybe a mother-in-law's unit or a grandmother's unit or rent it to a total stranger, and create some income to offset your mortgage. But there are people who buy homes and then they rent out rooms to help them because they can qualify, but then they don't necessarily want to have that big payment all to themselves.
Well, I'm a big fan of that. And I'm gonna let me walk through this because Josh just put this on the screen. Current mortgage rates compared in the last 5 decades. So 2010s, we got spoiled.
Yes.
Right, because 4.09.
Yeah, we were coming out of a historically bad, crash.
Right. And I think, what did I say,
they were trying to reinflate the housing market.
Today we're at 6.74. Mm-hmm. So basically, we're a half a point higher than the 2000s. Mm-hmm. And we're lower than the 90s. We're lower than the 80s. We're lower than the 70s. So, we're not in bad shape there. It's just that we've gotten spoiled.
We've gotten spoiled, and it allowed the pricing to probably come out of balance to where it would have if interest rates had stayed, hadn't dipped all the way down into the below 3% market. If they had stayed in the 4 to 5 range, the appreciation that you're enjoying in your house might be a little less over time because it's only going to appreciate so far with the interest rate. So I think because people could afford a larger payment or could afford to borrow more money, that inflated the price. So I'd say the example I like to use is that a lot of the condo projects, as an example, in North Orange County, they had a lid on them for years at around 55,000 when the FHA limit was right at 55,000. And then they raised the FHA limit to 82,000, and almost overnight, the value of those units all jumped to the highest part of the range.
Interesting. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So as FHA numbers change all the time, it's fascinating where we go. We've got a viewer here that we should harass a little bit because it's probably taking on a party out there.
Oh, is she in there?
He's in there anonymously, but we know who
nice.
it is.
I was going to give him a shout out, but I decided not to.
Good. That's good. Continue our conversation. Blake Vartanian is with us, Realty Pro 100. Been talking about maybe it's an artificial stimulant to housing prices. So I'm going to throw the contrary at you, Blake.
Sure.
So in the last segment, you were talking about how property values increased as the FHA mortgage limit increased.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll submit maybe it's just as much the conventional lending limits as FHA lending limits.
So it could be.
Because they kind of move hand in hand. They're not exactly the same, but they kind of move hand in hand. Would you say then that if they were to lower those numbers, that housing prices would drop?
I think it would cut off the money supply for certain eligible buyers that could potentially lead to a drop.
Okay.
But I'm not saying it would definitely. It just depends how many people are looking to use that particular loan program. But over time, I think what we found was that with entrepreneurship came alternatives.
Right.
Right. And so the mortgage market used to be far more diverse than it is today.
Was it really?
Like my first home mortgage in 1979, I actually spoke to the lady who was funding my home mortgage.
Oh, okay.
So that stopped. The mortgage broker typically today does not go out and seek private financing from, let's say, a group of doctors who pooled their money together
Sure.
to say we can do 4 or 5 mortgages. We have enough to support and get a better than whatever 10-year treasury return. We can get a higher interest rate by putting up somebody's mortgage for them. That those type of loan programs by and large are they're no longer even legal, let alone encouraged.
So it goes back to what I was saying in the
Yeah.
real-time real estate segment
Yeah.
that spread is increasing because of regulation.
Regulation, absolutely, and restriction of who controls the money. See, because there's not as many people competing because the government's only competing against one arm of itself against the other.
For the most part, yeah.
For the majority of mortgages. So I read
Like 70%, something like that.
Yeah. So it's
majority.
That's a monopoly by any standard.
Sure. Sure.
And so when you look at the number of households that are owned without a mortgage in the country, that's one of the reasons to believe that we're not headed for any type of massive correction as a nation, because 37% of the properties are owned without a mortgage, which means those people all have the equity to go and buy something.
37%.
That's what stat I just read a couple days
Wow.
ago.
Okay.
I
That's
didn't
big
bring
number.
it with me, but it's a big number.
Big number.
Well past 30, and you figure anytime you got 3 and 10 people,
Sure.
they can form a political party with 30%.
Yeah, exactly. And they can argue with everybody.
You might even.
We don't even want to go there.
No, I know, but it's
but the last number that I saw also was that of those with mortgages, the mortgage properties are at 42% loan to value.
Yes.
So even with a mortgage, you've got 58% equity. You're not going to go into foreclosure. You shouldn't be going into foreclosure.
No, if you're having trouble making your payment, you got several options. You can take on a roommate, or possibly look into if your place has enough space, can you add an ADU in the back? If you have to, sell it and take your equity, and don't leave your chips on the table if you can't afford to keep the ones you have.
And that's a big issue, which we actually have a segment right now. If you want to check out what Blake was just talking about, rsr3pctloan.com. rsr3pctloan.com actually talks about why that 3% mortgage could be killing you and holding you back. So we actually did a segment, Blake, talking about, and again, you can get the whole segment, rsr3pctloan.com. And it basically says, you got a 3% mortgage, but your household, you've got credit card debt and student loan debt and auto debt and unsecured debt. Your real household blended rate is somewhere between 6 and 8%. What if you sell your house, take some of your home equity and pay off your debts, take some of your home equity and buy a new house, and your payments are basically going to be the exact same as where you are right now with all of that debt combined, but you get that bigger house that you wanted.
I mean, that's the magic of actually having somebody do your homework for you, like you doing the homework, right? But for the average person to go and research all of that and calculate that on their own, they're not going to have the historical knowledge that someone like yourself is going to have to be able to fill in all the pieces and show them where the real value is, that there is money to be saved.
I shared that with a CPA I had a speaking engagement last week, and one of the CPAs came up to me afterwards. They said, no one's talking about this, But everyone's talking about there's no possible way someone's going to sell a house with a 3% mortgage. But there really is a way that you can help yourself financially by selling.
Well, you read at the same time on let's say Yahoo Finance, Bloomberg, whatever, that household credit card debt is skyrocketing in America.
Right.
Well, those people are borrowing on credit cards when they have substantial amount of equity in their properties. Like you just said, if the average is 58%, there's room to finance and get rid of the credit card debt and shred them. Don't clear them off and then start charging on them again.
That's the whole thing. Keep using them.
Right.
But pay them off every month.
Right.
And I heard a great one the other day. I said, because I didn't even think of this one. So I've talked about, we've all got a cellular phone bill. You can pay that with your credit card and then pay the credit card from your, right from your for unautomated payment. But how many people have Netflix?
Yes.
Right. What's that? And I have no idea. $10, $15 a month, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Put it on your credit card, then send an automated payment from your credit card right away. And that way it keeps that credit card active so it doesn't diminish the value in your FICO score.
That's perfect.
A lot of great information. And there's properties available. So I was just looking. The other thing, what do you attribute, Blake? I'm looking at this list that you had shared this morning. Orange County had of 2,400 active listings, 17 expired, 36 canceled. What is that saying to you?
Well, I mean, what it's saying is that, some people aren't fully prepared when they go into the escrow, or they've changed their mind. But oftentimes what happens is, we just had an example where someone hadn't filed their tax returns, and they were told they needed to file their tax returns prior to starting it. Their accountant didn't get it done. And then they ran down to the Santa Ana IRS office and had them hand filed, but now they're not in the system. So the lender couldn't approve
those tax returns. So they got to wait for a couple weeks.
Right.
Sure.
So it didn't really help that they ran down there and filed them. It probably would have been better if the accountant had just filed them electronically. They'd probably be there a lot faster.
Yeah, it usually still takes a couple of weeks, but
yeah.
But then again, in Orange County, you don't have to file until October 15th unless you need that income. But that's interesting information, because I look at it and I say, okay, now historically, is that a small number or a big number? That's 17 and 36 for the entire county.
I'd say that's for the entire county. That's it's a weekly cancellation rate, so I'd say that's pretty. It's pretty moderate. It's not a huge amount.
Something in Anaheim Hills says 0 expired, 0 canceled. Brea 0 and 1.
Yeah, we've gone through cycles where, if as a sales manager of a real estate company or owner of a real estate operation, if you put 400 sales on the board in a month with your team, you might expect 150 or 200 of them to cancel.
Really?
Oh yeah, we've been in those cycles
50%
many times over the last 4 decades. Yeah.
Wow, that's a big number.
Yeah.
Continue our conversation with Blake Vartanian this morning, Realty Pro 100. Just chatting about real estate and chatting about what the market holds. Now, and during the break, Blake, you and I were chatting a little bit about, how much some of these big institutions, Black Knight, I know, is a big holder of real estate. Have you seen that? And I don't want to get into the numbers because, we didn't talk about it. There's massive amounts. And yes, we are in the throes of negotiating right now to make some of these properties, not Black Knights, but another one, available to you. So make sure you're listening. But those companies that are absorbing so many properties, what do you think the impact is on the marketplace with something like that? Now, obviously, it takes properties out of the market. It probably increases the number of rentals in the marketplace. But my thinking, just off the top of my head, is those companies didn't get to be the size they are by thinking that the real estate market is about to crash.
No, they're investing in the fact that they believe it's going to keep going up, because they got to return to their investors, or they're going to have to explain why they didn't get that return.
Have you seen something like this historically, where there's institutions are buying, large percentages of the real estate in the marketplace?
Not so much in Orange County. I mean, you have companies with their, will buy, just like we have agents who bring investors who will buy directly from the consumer, explain what the value would be if they fixed it, if they sold it. And some people just don't want to put their house on the market. They want a private sale, and that can be arranged. But the overall trend, I think, in Orange County, because of the price point, or in Southern California, the price point, the demand, I think, these companies tend to buy larger swaths of neighborhoods in more outlying areas.
Sure.
So, secondary, what I call the secondary market cities like Phoenix, and
I just got a listing of one in Chicago.
Okay, Chicago.
That was
okay.
23 properties all going to foreclosure.
Oh,
And so I called a friend of mine in Chicago. He says, Ron, you don't want to go in that neighborhood.
okay.
Right. So, but again, that's exactly what you're saying there. Is those are probably, it's not a Newport Beach property.
Well, there was a time in the downturn in 2008 where I saw an article where you could go into downtown Detroit and buy a whole city block for $5,000.
Sure.
And I thought about speculating, buying just 2 or 3 blocks, just let the land sit there, but then I realized it's not where I want to be.
Sure, exactly.
So it doesn't matter how much money I might be able to make. I don't want to be seen as that person owning that. And even if you turn around and make a profit, you're not a capitalist. You're a profiteer. You're a robber baron. You're that type of thinker. And I don't want to be preying on other people's misfortune that way.
Yeah, well, and it's a good way of putting it. It is other people's misfortune, but I'm the first to admit that back in the early part of this century, I used to do some of the subprime lending.
Yes.
And a lot of people look at it and say, "Oh, you're really taking advantage of people." And I said, "Well, Mr. and Mrs. Jones were about to be foreclosed upon.
Yeah.
And we lent them money on some of the equity of their property.
Mm-hmm.
Is that taking advantage of them, or is that helping them?"
Well, and for so many people in that cycle, I mean, I've told the story before of how I consulted with people in Yorba Linda whose home at that time in 2007 was worth 1.2 million, and they wanted 1.4. And I said, no. And it ended up within 18 months, it ended up in foreclosure going for under 800,000 because the values had fallen that far in such a short period of time. But it took what I call historic fraud in the lending practices for that to happen.
Sure.
And we're not dealing with that today. Today, the mortgages are checked and rechecked, and
a lot of back end checks,
right, that
people don't even know that. And Blake, you and I know this. There's a lot of check and fraud and back end re-verifications.
Absolutely.
That the average consumer doesn't even know is taking place.
No.
Right. And there are loans, and we were talking before about properties that get canceled or listings that get canceled. We've seen some of them where there was fraud detected in a back end search, or sometimes not even fraud. People are ignorant, right?
Definitely.
You've got a will or a trust that leaves a property to a minor, right? Can't sell that property, right? Because a minor can't enter into the contract. So they've got to get the judge to approve it, the whole 9 yards. So there's a lot of different things. Again, you want to make sure you're working with professional realtors and professional your whole professional team that has some experience and knows what they're doing to get the better outcomes.
Well, I mean, I've heard the stories through the years. I've never actually been in a transaction or seen it where somebody left in their trust. They left the cat, the executor. And I've heard, I've laughed when I heard it, but I was like, I don't know, I didn't know whether it was serious or not. But if they really loved their pet that much and their family, or didn't want their family to have it that, with that much vim and vigor, then I guess the courts have to settle it out.
I'd like to see the cat sign those that grant deed, right? I mean, that might be a little bit of a challenge.